girl arrives at a castle in the mountains of Hungary. Her family has sent her here to learn courtly manners and the skills a young woman needs to marry well and serve in a noble household. For a peasant family, this represents the opportunity of a lifetime. The castle appears impressive. The countess herself seems gracious and well-spoken, coming from one of the most powerful families in Europe. Everything looks proper and orderly. She walks through the gates, the doors close behind her, and she never leaves again. Her name is lost to history. She is one of hundreds, possibly more. No one kept track of the peasant girls who disappeared into that castle. The woman who owned that castle would later become known as the most prolific female serial killer in recorded history. Her name was Elizabeth Bathory, and this story is more disturbing than any horror film because every detail comes from the testimony of people who were actually present. Before we enter that castle, leave a comment with your city and country, because once you understand what the Blood Countess did behind those walls, it becomes clear why authorities eventually sealed her alive inside her own castle. Elizabeth Bathory was not born into a family that typically produces criminals. She was born into a family known for producing rulers. Her uncle was the King of Poland. Her cousin was the Prince of Transylvania. Cardinals, knights, judges, and military commanders filled her extended family. The Bathory name was firmly placed within the power structure of Eastern Europe for generations. This was not simply a noble family. It was a dominant one, respected and feared by others. However, the family also had a darker reputation. Some relatives were known for cruelty, instability, and behaviors that other nobles often tried to conceal. Whispers about these matters were often shared behind closed doors. Elizabeth had an aunt named Carla who, according to several accounts, took pleasure in tormenting servants in the same way other women enjoyed embroidery. Some sources claim Carla was the person who first showed young Elizabeth that hurting others was not only tolerated in their world, but could also be treated as entertainment. At the age of 15, Elizabeth was married to a man named Ferenc Nadasdy. It was a political union, bringing together two powerful families and strengthening their bloodlines. Nadasdy was a soldier and a warrior, the type of man who earned his reputation through combat. He became known as the Black Hungarian because of his actions against the Ottoman Turks. He was feared by opposing forces, respected at court, and familiar with cruelty in ways that extended beyond warfare. Some sources suggest he introduced Elizabeth to certain harsh methods, not just punishment or discipline, but practices that crossed the line into taking satisfaction from suffering. However, Nadasdy was rarely home. The Ottoman Wars kept him stationed at the frontier for months, sometimes even years. During his absence, Elizabeth remained alone, managing the castle, directing the servants, and operating without oversight. The first troubling reports began during this period. There were accounts of punishments that went too far, discipline that did not match the offense, and girls who entered the castle healthy but left injured, or did not leave at all. Still, no investigation followed because she belonged to the Bathory family, and members of that family were rarely questioned. Then, in 1604, Nadasdy died. Some believed it was due to an untreated battle wound, while others suggested revenge connected to his personal life. Regardless of the cause, the Black Hungarian was gone, and any limited restraint that may have existed on Elizabeth's behavior disappeared completely. By this time, she was in her 40s, a wealthy widow with extensive estates and multiple castles. Without a husband or father to supervise her, and with only a distant king holding authority above her, she operated with significant independence. She possessed wealth, influence, privacy, and whatever troubling tendencies had developed over the previous 2 decades now faced little resistance. This period marked the formation of her inner circle, not ordinary servants, but individuals who actively participated in her actions. Alona Jo, Elizabeth's childhood nurse who had served her since birth, later testified that she personally killed around 50 girls. Dorothea Sentes, known as Dorco, was an older woman whose reputation for cruelty closely matched that of the Countess. She carried out some of the harshest acts, particularly those that required determination and emotional detachment. Janos Ugeri, a teenage boy called Fico, handled the physical tasks involved, managing duties that required strength and secrecy. Then there was Anna Darvulia, often described by some as a witch. She was Elizabeth's closest associate, confidant, and according to certain reports, a mentor who helped refine methods, introduce new practices, and encouraged further experimentation. These individuals were not unwilling participants. According to trial records, they acted with enthusiasm. They assisted in selecting victims, planning actions, and burying bodies in church graveyards at night while performing rituals over the graves. The victims continued to arrive. Most were young girls, daughters of peasant families who sent them to the castle with hopes of securing a better future. These girls entered expecting to learn household skills such as needlework, but instead faced conditions that survivors later struggled to describe. Few believed such accusations could be made against one of the most powerful women in Hungary. Elizabeth understood this advantage. What she did to these girls, based on testimony from more than 300 witnesses during the investigation, exceeded what most fictional stories attempt to portray. Unlike fictional narratives, her actions showed few limits. The abuse reportedly began with beatings, not minor discipline, but prolonged and severe physical attacks. Some victims were struck repeatedly until they were left with serious injuries. One witness later described a single incident that appeared to continue for an extended period without pause. Yet the beatings were only the beginning of increasingly severe treatment. Elizabeth reportedly used needles during these acts. According to testimony, she inserted them into different parts of the body, especially sensitive areas, increasing the level of pain. Ilona Joe testified that on certain occasions, so many needles were used that a victim's appearance was compared to that of a hedgehog. This description comes directly from witness statements recorded during the investigation. Later reports mention the use of scissors. Injuries became more intentional and controlled. These actions were not only harmful but also aimed at permanently damaging the victims. Witnesses also described biting, an action that appeared repeatedly across multiple testimonies, making it difficult to dismiss as exaggeration. Elizabeth was said to bite victims in ways intended to cause clear harm. Some statements indicate that these acts extended beyond what witnesses could fully describe, leaving even those present deeply unsettled. Following this came reports of burning. Heated objects were allegedly used in ways intended to cause intense pain. Ilona Joe described items being heated until extremely hot and then pressed against the skin, held in place as suffering continued. When burning methods were not used, exposure to extreme cold was reported. During harsh Hungarian winters, victims were taken outside and left in freezing conditions. Water was poured over them repeatedly, forcing them to remain in the snow for long periods without the ability to escape. In certain accounts, victims were covered with substances such as honey and left outdoors, exposing them to insects. One testimony describes a victim being forced to prepare and consume parts of her own body. Details were limited, but the statement itself was considered disturbing enough without further explanation. Throughout these reported events, Elizabeth displayed little visible reaction. Witnesses described no hesitation or emotional response. Even when she was ill and unable to stand, victims were reportedly brought to her bedside so she could continue inflicting harm. According to statements, her actions did not pause due to illness. Large amounts of blood were often reported in connection with these acts. Servants were said to spread ashes around her bed to manage the situation. Her clothing required frequent changing, sometimes multiple times per day. The walls of her chamber needed constant cleaning, and the castle developed a strong metallic odor that residents recognized. This leads to the well-known legend that made Elizabeth Bathory widely remembered in history. According to a popular story, the event began with an accident. A servant brushing Elizabeth's hair pulled too hard, removing several strands. In response, Elizabeth struck the servant, causing blood to fall onto her hand. According to the legend, she noticed her skin where the blood had touched and believed it appeared smoother and younger. From that point forward, the story claims she began bathing in the blood of young girls, believing it could preserve youth. However, the accuracy of this claim remains debated. The story of blood bathing first appeared in written form in 1729, more than a century after her death. The original trial records do not mention such acts. What remains significant is that people who lived within the castle and witnessed the events believed she was capable of such behavior. The severity of what they had already observed made even extreme claims seem possible. For many years, no one intervened because most victims were peasants. Their families lacked authority, influence, and access to legal systems or royal courts. During the 16th century in Hungary, a noble harming servants was often treated as a private matter rather than a public scandal. This situation continued until Elizabeth made a critical mistake. That mistake led to testimony from approximately 300 witnesses, resulted in the execution of her accomplices, and ultimately caused the authorities to confine the Countess within her own castle, where she remained sealed inside until her death. For years, Elizabeth's victims came from the same background: peasant villages, farming families, people with no connections, no power, and no way to defend themselves. That is why she managed to continue for so long. In 16th century Hungary, peasant girls were largely unnoticed. They could disappear in large numbers, and no authority figure would pay attention or take action. But around 1609, something changed. Anna Darvulia, Elizabeth's closest confidant and the woman who had influenced her behavior for years, died. Her replacement was a woman named Ertzi Majorova, a local farmer's widow who claimed to practice witchcraft. Majorova introduced an idea that would eventually lead to Elizabeth's downfall. Elizabeth was aging, approaching the age of 50. If the stories about blood and youth had any truth behind them, then peasant victims were no longer serving the purpose she believed in. The signs of aging continued, and whatever belief she held in maintaining youth appeared to fail. Majorova suggested a different solution. According to her reasoning, the issue was not the method but the quality. She argued that peasant blood was ordinary and inferior. If Elizabeth wanted better results, she needed higher status victims, noble blood, the blood of girls from respected families, those with lineage and social standing. This advice proved disastrous, yet Elizabeth accepted it. She began selecting victims from a new group. Instead of peasant daughters, she established what appeared to be a finishing school within her castle, presenting it as an academy for young women from lesser noble families. Parents sent their daughters there to learn music, manners, languages, and the proper skills expected of noblewomen. The setup appeared legitimate and convincing, but it was not. Noble girls began disappearing in the same pattern as the peasant girls before them. However, this time there was a critical difference. Peasant families lacked influence, but noble families possessed strong connections. They had relationships within royal courts and political circles. When their daughters failed to return home, when letters were left unanswered, and when explanations stopped making sense, these families did not remain silent. They began demanding answers, raising concerns that eventually reached the king himself. This marked the moment when authority turned against Elizabeth Bathory. King Matthias II of Hungary received the complaints and could not ignore them. These concerns came from powerful noble families capable of creating political consequences. In response, he assigned his highest-ranking representative, Georgi Thurzo, to investigate. Thurzo held the position of Palatine of Hungary, making him the second most powerful figure in the kingdom. His involvement created a complicated situation. He was familiar with the Bathory family and understood the consequences that uncovering the truth could bring to the nobility as a whole. He recognized that placing a woman of Elizabeth's status on public trial could create a scandal capable of shaking the political structure of the country. Yet he could not ignore the situation, especially with noble families demanding justice. He began gathering testimony, and the results were overwhelming. Reports arrived from hundreds of individuals. Approximately 300 witnesses who had observed events, experienced harm, or knew victims personally. Servants described what they had seen inside the castle. Villagers reported seeing bodies carried out at night. Families spoke of daughters who entered the castle and were never heard from again. Survivors carried injuries that served as evidence of what they had endured. The collected testimony created a picture that was consistent and detailed. Even when considering possible exaggeration or political motives, the central facts remained clear. Serious crimes had occurred within that castle, carried out repeatedly over many years. On December 30th, 1610, Thurzo arrived at Castle Sedged without warning. What he discovered has been debated by historians ever since. Some dramatic versions claim he found Elizabeth actively harming a victim, while more reliable accounts suggest she was eating dinner at the time. Regardless of the exact circumstances, the condition of the castle itself was undeniable. One girl was found dead, recently killed, and another was discovered alive but injured, showing clear evidence of severe treatment. Elizabeth was arrested immediately, along with her 4 accomplices, Ilona Jo, Dorotea Sentes, Janos Fixco, and Katerina Banica. The trials began in January 1611. During questioning, the accomplices provided statements. Some spoke under pressure, while others responded to formal interrogation. Their descriptions shocked even experienced judges who had dealt with violent criminals throughout their careers. Ilona Jo admitted to personally killing around 50 girls. She described the methods used, including heated objects, severe physical harm, and acts that caused lasting injury. Dorotea Sentes confirmed the use of cutting tools, burning, and needles. She added details about how victims were restrained so tightly that lasting damage occurred, and how beatings exceeded all reasonable limits. Fixco, the teenage assistant, explained logistical details, where bodies were hidden, how many he helped bury, and which graveyards were used. He described nighttime burials carried out in secrecy, digging in darkness and concealing evidence before sunrise. Another significant claim came from a servant named Susanna. She testified about a private record she believed existed, a written register kept by Elizabeth herself that listed victims by name. According to Susanna, this record contained approximately 650 entries, documenting victims as if they were items in storage. The alleged book was never discovered, and its existence could not be confirmed. However, the courts found Elizabeth and her accomplices responsible for 80 murders based on available evidence. Even that confirmed number placed Elizabeth Bathory among the most prolific serial killers recorded in history. Punishment for the accomplices followed quickly. Dorotea Sentes and Ilona Jo received severe sentences and were executed after public punishment. The same individuals who had participated in years of violence faced violent ends themselves. Fixco was also executed, receiving a faster sentence, and his body was burned alongside the others. Ertzi Majorova, the woman believed to have encouraged the targeting of noble victims, was captured later and executed. Katerina Banica received a life sentence. Evidence suggested she had also suffered abuse and was considered less responsible than the others. She became the only accomplice to survive the proceedings. Elizabeth herself, however, was never formally tried. Despite testimony from approximately 300 witnesses, confirmation of at least 80 murders, and claims suggesting many more victims, she never appeared before a judge or received a standard verdict. The reason lay in her status. She belonged to the powerful Bathory family. A public trial involving someone of her rank would expose the nobility to scandal and public shame. Family members negotiated privately to prevent a public court proceeding. Additionally, the king owed a financial debt to her late husband, which may have influenced decisions. A quiet resolution served the interests of powerful figures, even if it ignored justice for the victims. Instead of facing trial, Elizabeth received a different punishment. Authorities ordered her confinement inside her own residence. Workers arrived at Castle Sedged and sealed the windows of her chamber with brick. Doors were closed permanently, leaving only a small opening large enough to pass food through. Elizabeth Bathory, widely known as the Blood Countess, was confined within her own room. She remained isolated from visitors, without direct communication, surrounded only by walls and darkness. This condition lasted for 4 years. During that time, she lived in complete confinement. Without windows, she had no clear sense of day or night. She heard only the voices of guards delivering food through the opening. There were no mirrors, no companions, and no opportunity to leave. She remained isolated with her thoughts, unable to control others as she once had. For the first time, she experienced a complete loss of power. On August 21, 1614, a guard noticed that the food delivered earlier that day had not been touched. When he looked inside, he discovered the outcome that ended her confinement. Elizabeth Bathory was dead. She was 54 years old, discovered lying on the floor of her sealed chamber. There were no witnesses to her final moments, no record of her last words, and no dramatic ending. Only a body in a dark room, alone, in conditions similar to those her victims had faced, in silence and darkness, with no one arriving to help. She was buried on her estate. Some reports state that her body was later moved after local residents objected to having her remains buried nearby. Even after her death, people did not want her presence close to their community. The Register, the book that was said to contain around 650 names written in Elizabeth's own handwriting, remained missing. That record, if it existed, could have confirmed or denied the full number of victims connected to her actions. Some believed the book was destroyed by her family to prevent further scandal. Others believed it never existed at all. There are also claims that it may still exist somewhere, hidden in an archive or private collection, waiting to be discovered. She was buried, relocated, and gradually faded from daily memory. However, her name continued to survive. Elizabeth Bathory, often referred to as the Blood Countess, became known as a figure who demonstrated that the most dangerous location in 16th century Hungary was not always the battlefield or the Ottoman frontier. Instead, it could be a castle in the mountains where a noblewoman invited young girls under the promise of education and opportunity. The most troubling aspect of this story is not only what Elizabeth did, but how long it continued. For approximately 20 years, 2 full decades, girls disappeared into that castle. For years, bodies were buried in secrecy, and reports of suffering went unheard because the victims were individuals with little social standing. She was not stopped immediately because of discovery alone. Her actions were halted when she began targeting girls from influential families, young women whose relatives possessed the power to demand answers and refuse silence. Their disappearances could not be ignored, dismissed, or hidden without consequence. For the peasant girls who disappeared during those earlier years, few people intervened. Their names were rarely recorded, their stories seldom documented, and their losses often went unnoticed by authorities. In many ways, they represent the central focus of this history. Not the Countess, not the rumors, and not the legend itself, but the many young girls who entered the castle expecting improved opportunities and instead faced outcomes far worse than they had imagined.